You're listening to the Monday Night Community Show with Daniel on BRFM.
I see the point you're
and
trying...
And yours?
Blackburn. George Blackburn.
You see the point I'm making?
Are we talking about the lady with the letters again?
No, but we could be. What I mean is, she was living two kinds of lives. One to everybody's face, the other behind closed doors. A bit like me.
Like you?
I was one person when I was young with one name. Now that I'm older, I've adopted another one.
I really must...
I have a twin sister, Catherine. Did I mention that?
Yes, only moments ago.
The very image of her I am. Or her of me, depending on how you choose to look at it. Or her. Anyway, when we were young, our mother would dress us up exactly the same. Dresses, hair, shoes, the works. Of course, at the time, I just assumed that everyone had a reflection of themselves. You can imagine how surprised I was when it turned out that wasn't the case.
Yes.
You see, George, to the world in general, we were so alike. No one else could tell us apart.
Right. I'm sure that's the case with twins.
But our mother, we were as different as chalk and cheese.
Yes, I can see that.
Only she could see what the rest of the world could not.
If you say so.
Your brother was Gerald Hopkins.
I said my name was...
Blackburn, but it's not. You changed it in 1961, following the killing of a group of young people carried out by your brother, Gerald. There's no point denying it.
Even now, after all these years, someone will stop me in the street and say what you have just said. Gerald was a disturbed young man. I suppose he had what people now would call issues.
He killed 6 people.
I'm not defending him.
He used a bow and arrow dipped with insecticides from your father's garden shed.
Something like that.
DDT was used a lot back then, to get rid of bedbugs. It also caused nervous system disorders, birth defects, leukemia due to its carcinogenic qualities. Even if Gerald hadn't finished them off that day, he hoped to pass on illnesses to those families for years. He must have really hated them.
I suppose if I said to you that all that was a long time ago, it would cut little ice with you. May I ask where you lived until recently?
Pete's from the northeast.
It's a large area, the northeast. Where exactly?
Stockton-upon-Tees. 19 Marlow Street. You grew up in 21 Marlow Street. Do you remember my neighbour, Mrs. Turnbull?
No.
You never met her?
I'm afraid not.
She moved in with her family about 5 years after you left.
Well, there you are.
Mrs. Turnbull was only young at the time, but she soon became interested in the history of the area.
Did she?
And of her neighbours. Back then there was no Google searches, and although your brother was big in the news, memories fade. After all, people carry on. Tomorrow's chip wrappers, as they say. Easy to lose focus, I guess, to get distracted. What was he like?
Who?
Gerald.
Why do you want to know?
I've always been interested in the minds of psychopaths. Why they do what they do. Is it really spontaneous, or do they plan it out in advance? Why they're predominantly white males.
Are they?
Apparently, over 90%.
That sounds fascinating, if a little worrying.
They also have a habit of being rather clever.
Are you sure?
Very high IQs.
Oh, I don't know.
Up there in the high normal range.
Did you read this?
Lots of work has been done on the subject, George. People have studied them. They are, after all, a bit of a type.
Were there no happy subjects they could have spent their time on?
Happiness doesn't hold people's attention, George. No one ever sat down and decided to make joy and contentment an area of study.
Maybe we'd all be a bit happier if someone did.
I doubt that, George.
Do you not think this is a little macabre? Several things you could do.
I also read that some people that do unspeakable things were very often unhappy at school.
Weren't we all unhappy at school?
I wasn't. I enjoyed school.
Oh, very good.
Oh, yes. I learned a few things at school as well. Learned a few things. That just came out.
I would hope that you did learn one or two things.
Oh, I learned when the Battle of Hastings was, and the names of all the Henry VIII's wives, in order at one point. But what I was meaning was something else.
Really?
To watch people. To study
Well, I'm not sure that I...
who turns on who and why.
Turns on?
People can only be pushed so far, George, and then they
What?
turn on their tormentors. Gerald took up archery in the late 50s, didn't he?
Father thought Gerard was too much of a loner. He was a bit harsh on him. Now that I look back, Father was always hard on him, criticising him for one thing or another. It means a lot at that age, but Father ignored Gerald after a while.
And your mother?
Oh, she was an angel and always loved us, even after... I don't think Father ever appreciated Gerald. He never came up to Father's rather exacting standards. Gerald, now I look back, turned to himself.
You mean he had very few friends?
No friends, in fact.
What about clubs or the local school?
Oh, Father tried to encourage him to play football, but he was never a strong child. Weak, slow. The other kids, well, teenagers can be cruel, don't you think? Name-calling, threats, physical, bags stolen. That was a big thing back then. Bicycle tyres let down and then slashed with a penknife. Clothes going missing after PE. And once he had to walk home in his underpants, other boys shouting and jeering at him all the way. As I said, he withdrew into his room.
But the house was small. You shared a room, didn't you?
We were luckier than most. Times were hard, but at least we had a roof over our head. There were many that didn't.
So Gerald had a tough time.
I'm not making excuses for him.
I'm not saying you are.
Gerald did what he did. That should have been an end to it.
Is it ever the end to it?
It was a terrible, terrible day, Rosemary. A day I and others shall never forget.
For the families of his victims, they could never forget George.
Of course they couldn't. How could they? We all suffered for years.
What about you?
Yes, I also was at a loss to understand.
No, what I meant was, didn't you have friends, or were you like Gerald?
Myself and Gerald, we were always different. He was much more cerebral, shall we say. Internal, in fact. At one point, he could read a book a day and understand it. Mechanics, engineering, philosophy, physics, he knew it all. He was wasted at school. I felt he could have taught the teachers a thing or two. I said to him once, "You're the one the others should listen to." But he was too modest, too shy. Do you know, and you won't find this in any book on the subject, that we were once set homework to build a model of a small plane. All the other children spent the weekend with their fathers in their backyards trying to make wooden aircraft. Gerald just got a piece of paper, folded it up and sent it up and over the classroom. Simple, you see. The teacher had asked us to make a small plane, not recreate an airline. He was brilliant like that, going straight to the heart of the problem. Assess the issue and think beyond it. I suppose, Ros, you'd call it something like thinking outside of the box. He was good at that sort of thing, a genius in many ways, but it wasn't recognised. Anyway, you won't find that in any of the articles that were written.
No, they're mostly about his actions on the 15th of July 1961.
Yes, well, they would be, wouldn't they?
It's understandable, George. After all, he did kill 6 people. With a bow and arrow.
You really don't have to go on about it, Rosemary. It was written about a lot at the time.
Yes, I know. I found out quite a bit about that day on the internet. There's all sorts of things that people have said about it.
People always say things. The less they know, the louder they talk.
Was it bad?
I'm almost certain, Ros, I don't need to answer that.
Friends? Colleagues, neighbours?
Yes, it was bad. People turned away from us. Any that tried to stay in contact with us were then ostracised. My father worked at the time in the pits. Well, you could back then. Terrible job. Have you ever been down a coal mine?
No, I haven't.
He would always argue, whenever I complained about anything, it could be worse. He never once said this is how to make it better. Now, with the politicians, bankers, the economy and people in general, no one seems to take pride in much of anything these days. Only the other day I was
One
thinking...
of Gerald's victims, his father, also worked down the mine as well, didn't he?
Yes.
Joseph Powell in your year at school. His father was called Joshua. He worked at the same pit. Before that day it said he and your father were good friends. After that day, less so.
Yes, Joshua confronted Father.
And
they argued.
It was a bit more than an argument, George. It came to blows.
Joshua was angry, sad, grief-stricken. Of course he was. He had lost his son.
Did you like him?
I hardly knew Joshua.
Joseph.
I hardly knew him. Not in my circle.
But Gerald knew him.
Gerald knew everybody.
I thought you said Gerald was a bit of a loner. Staying in his bedroom, your shared bedroom.
No one is an island, Roz. Even the quietest of people come into contact with others.
What did Joshua and your father argue about?
I think we've covered that.
I told you I had a sister.
You did.
We're really close. Sometimes, I don't know, this will sound a bit suspicious, but it really is true. We even seem to know each other, even what the other one is thinking. I'm sure you've heard people say that. They think, I must call my relative, and then the phone starts to ring. I'm sure you must have heard people say that over the years. George?
Yes, I've heard people say something like that.
In my case, it is true. No, it is. I know everything about her.
I see.
Her opinion on things, what she likes to drink or eat, what clothes she wears at the weekend, what she likes to talk about. And I'm sure she does with me. It's just one of those things, the way in which some people become so close to another person that you could almost be that person. In personality, I mean. Are you following me?
I believe so, Roz.
Oh, yes. If she's happy or sad, then I'm happy or sad. In fact, in our youth, we were so attuned to each other. That's the word, isn't it? Attuned. Interchangeable. To almost everyone else, identical. Except to those who knew us the closest. Family, for example. Once, Catherine got caught stealing an apple. She'd already blotted her copybook for some reason or other, so asked me if I'd say I was her. So I went to the home owner concerned and apologised for taking his fruit. Mr. Jones, his name was, if I'm remembering correctly. And do you know what? He never batted an eyelid. To this day, I don't think he ever knew. But when I tried the same trick, my mother knew instantly, and so the game was up.